He just wanted to congratulate his grandmother, but his words in front of the cake silenced everyone. What happened at this holiday table, no one will forget. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The wind stirred gently through the cemetery, brushing over rows of pale marble stones like invisible fingers, turning the pages of a book no one wanted to read. The air was cool for a spring afternoon, but not cold enough to explain the chill that settled deep in Lauren's bones. She stood beside her son, dressed in a simple black dress that clung to her like the memory of everything she had lost. Her hands, gloved and trembling, clutched a small white rose, the last of the bouquet she had brought for Adam's grave. Jaden stood quietly at her side, his small hand tucked into hers, his other hand gripping the lapel of his black blazer. He hadn't said much all morning. He didn't need to. The silence between them was heavier than any words could carry, laden with grief, confusion, and a quiet strength Lauren was only beginning to understand in her son. Across from them stood the rest of the family. Barbara and Henry, Adam's parents, flanked by distant relatives Lauren hardly recognized and had barely spoken to in years. They stood in a tight cluster like marble statues carved from the same cold quarry. Barbara wore a pearl gray coat with matching gloves, her blonde hair pulled into a flawless chignon, her face a blank canvas of restrained sorrow. But there were no tears, not even glassy eyes. Just composure, poise, distance. Henry, tall and gaunt, kept one hand on his cane and the other tucked into his coat pocket. He hadn't once looked in Lauren's direction since she arrived. The minister's voice droned on, offering words of comfort that fell like rain on stone. Lauren listened only partially, her mind caught somewhere between the past and the surreal reality that Adam, her Adam, was gone. Just days ago, he had kissed her goodbye before driving to a late meeting. Hours later, a police officer knocked on her door. Drunk driver, intersection, no survivors. The words blurred after that, each one like a stone thrown into still water, rippling through her carefully balanced life. As the ceremony drew to a close, mourners began to step forward to lay flowers on the casket. Lauren hesitated. She didn't want to move, didn't want to break the fragile barrier holding her together, but Jaden, with the solemnity of someone twice his age, gently pulled her hand. "We should say goodbye," he whispered, barely audible. Lauren nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. They stepped forward together. She bent slightly, lowering the rose onto the polished wood of the coffin. For a moment, she thought she felt Adam's warmth beside her, the echo of his laughter, the memory of his arm around her shoulders. And then it was gone. When they turned to walk back, Lauren caught Barbara's eyes. It was only a moment, but it told her everything. No welcome, no shared grief. Just blame, well hidden behind a practiced social mask. It wasn't the first time she had seen that look from her late husband's mother, but it was the first time it felt so final. Back at the family home, everything unfolded with chilling efficiency. The reception was immaculate. Crystal glasses of white wine, platters of carefully arranged hors d'oeuvres, and hushed murmurs of condolences. The kind of mourning that wore a designer dress and touched up its lipstick in the hallway mirror. Lauren stood near the fireplace, holding a glass she hadn't sipped from, watching Jaden nibble at a cracker in the corner. The room was full of people, but she felt utterly alone. Conversations flowed around her, but no one spoke to her. Barbara flitted from guest to guest, offering tight smiles and practiced grace. She didn't approach Lauren, not even once. Henry stayed seated, nodding politely at anyone who passed, but keeping his distance. At one point, a distant cousin approached Lauren and offered a perfunctory, "So sorry for your loss," before turning to compliment the floral arrangements. Lauren gave a tight smile and thanked her. This was how it always was. Polite, cold, distant, a family that tolerated her presence only for Adam's sake. And now that Adam was gone, she could feel the floor shifting beneath her feet. There was no place left for her in this house. She found herself wandering upstairs, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, to breathe. She paused outside the door to Adam's old bedroom. It was closed. She didn't try the knob. Some rooms were better left unopened. Instead, she stepped into the guest room, shut the door, and allowed herself a moment to fall apart. She sat on the edge of the neatly made bed, her hands clutched together, her head bowed. Silent tears slid down her cheeks. There was no comfort here, no sense of belonging, just the cold reminder that even in death, Adam's family could not see her. Later, as she and Jaden prepared to leave, Barbara finally approached. Her voice was clipped, neutral, as she handed Jaden a small gift bag. "For the boy," she said, "not your son, not Jaden, just the boy." "Thank you," Lauren said quietly, forcing civility through clenched teeth. Barbara looked at her, eyes narrow, lips tight. "You'll be all right, I suppose," she said flatly, as if commenting on the weather. Lauren gave a short nod. "We'll manage." Barbara turned without another word. The conversation was over before it had truly begun. On the drive home, Jaden was unusually quiet. Lauren glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He stared out the window, his small hands resting in his lap. "Do you want to talk about anything?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "Not right now." They returned to their modest two-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Clean, warm, filled with soft light and quiet corners. A space where Lauren didn't have to shrink herself to fit someone else's expectations. That night, after Jaden had gone to bed, she sat alone on the couch, curled in a blanket, staring at the flicker of the television. She wasn't watching. Her mind was still at the funeral, still replaying the coldness, the looks, the feeling of being erased. Her grief wasn't just for Adam. It was for the future they wouldn't have, the family she had tried so hard to be part of, and the realization that her son might grow up without ever feeling accepted by the people who shared his last name. She closed her eyes and whispered his name. Adam. Just once. In the room down the hall, Jaden slept curled on his side, his small frame bundled under the covers. He had lost his father, and already the world was trying to show him who didn't think he belonged. But Lauren promised herself right then and there that she wouldn't let it shape him. Not like it had shaped her. She had learned to stay quiet, to be agreeable, to accept less than she deserved because it was easier than fighting. But Jaden, he deserved better. He deserved to know he was worthy, no matter what color his skin was, no matter who refused to see him. She would give him that. She would teach him that love was not conditional. That family did not have the right to belittle or erase. That he could stand tall in a room full of people who didn't understand him and still be whole. That night, she didn't sleep much, but she held on to the warmth of her home, the rhythm of her son's breathing, and the hope, however small, that maybe, just maybe, they could break the cycle. The silence after the funeral was loud, echoing in every quiet room and unsaid word. But in that silence, a new resolve was forming, not just to survive, but to protect, to rise, and one day, to speak the truths she had spent a lifetime suppressing. And, in the corner of that quiet living room, the first seed of that truth began to take root. It had been nearly a year since the funeral, but the weight of that day still lingered in the corners of Lauren's mind like dust that refused to be swept away. Time had moved forward in the way it always does, relentlessly and without compassion. The seasons had cycled, Jaden had grown another inch or two, and the ache in her chest where Adam's absence lived had dulled into something constant but bearable. Their lives had settled into a rhythm that was not easy but survivable, held together by early mornings, packed lunches, bedtime routines, and moments of unexpected laughter that made the grief feel less cruel. Lauren had returned to work part-time as a community college writing instructor, teaching evening courses to a mix of young hopefuls and older adults trying to change their lives. She liked the work. It reminded her of who she had been before everything had unraveled. She had carved out a quiet life for herself and Jaden, one filled with structure, warmth, and gentleness. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And in that small, rented apartment on the edge of town, they had something that had never existed in the house Adam grew up in: peace. Still, despite the distance and the silence, Barbara and Henry's presence loomed like a shadow over everything. The phone never rang with their voices, and yet Lauren felt their disapproval in every blank space. They hadn't visited since the funeral, but twice they had sent messages through Adam's sister, Meredith, who lived in another state. Meredith was kinder than most of the family, and she had always shown a quiet respect for Lauren, but even her sympathy came with the caveat of neutrality. She wasn't going to rock the family boat, not even for Lauren and Jaden. So it was through Meredith that Lauren received word that Barbara and Henry wanted to see Jaden. Not her, just the child. Lauren had stared at the message on her phone for a long time, wondering if she was being petty for how sharply the words cut. There had been no offer to meet halfway, no suggestion of inclusion, just the assumption that Lauren would send her son into the lion's den and thank them for the opportunity. She hadn't wanted to agree. Every instinct in her body told her to refuse. But then she had looked at Jaden, playing quietly with his Lego bricks on the living room floor, and thought about how much he had lost. If there was any chance for him to have even a fraction of the relationship Adam had once dreamed about, grandparents who loved him, who remembered his birthday, who showed up for the big moments, Lauren didn't want to be the one who cut that possibility off. So she agreed, hesitantly. She drove Jaden to the house in Northwood Hills on a chilly Saturday afternoon and watched from the car as he walked up the pristine steps alone, clutching the book he had picked out to show them. He turned once to wave, and she smiled, though her stomach twisted. She waited in a coffee shop a few blocks away, checking her phone every 5 minutes, fighting the urge to drive back and scoop him up. 3 hours later, he came back out, expression unreadable, and slid into the passenger seat. "How was it?" she asked, forcing lightness into her voice. Jaden shrugged. "Okay." He didn't say much else, and Lauren didn't push. But over the next few weeks, little details began to surface, like slivers of glass beneath the skin. Barbara had corrected him when he called her Grandma Barbie, saying it sounded childish. Henry had scolded him for not knowing the names of the presidents. He was given a white action figure and told it looked like his father. There were no photos of Lauren in the house, not even their wedding picture, which had once sat on the mantel. When Lauren asked him gently how he felt about going again, he hesitated before saying, "Maybe not this weekend." She didn't argue. She just wrapped her arms around him and held him close. There was a day in early April when they ran into Barbara in the park. It was a rare, warm afternoon, and Lauren and Jaden had stopped for ice cream after school. They were laughing about something silly. Jaden had chocolate on his nose and was pretending to be a raccoon when Barbara appeared from behind a hedge, dressed in tennis whites and carrying a designer water bottle. "Jaden," she said, her voice tight with surprise. "How unexpected." Jaden stepped forward instinctively, but Barbara did not open her arms. Instead, she placed a careful hand on his shoulder, then quickly withdrew and wiped her palm with a handkerchief. Lauren stood a few feet away, her heart hardening. Barbara did not acknowledge her beyond a nod. "We were just out enjoying the weather," Lauren said, her tone neutral. Barbara smiled, but it was brittle. "Yes, well, some of us have routines to maintain." She glanced at her watch and excused herself, disappearing down the path without another word. That night, Jaden was quiet. Lauren found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at a photo of Adam. "Do I look like him?" he asked. Lauren sat beside him. "Yes, you have his eyes, his smile." He didn't answer right away. "I don't think Grandma thinks so." Lauren's throat tightened. "What makes you say that?" "She said I have your features, like it's a bad thing." Lauren took his hand. "You are perfect exactly as you are." He nodded, but she could see the questions gathering behind his eyes. She thought about the past again, the early years with Adam, the first time she had met his parents. How Barbara had smiled and shaken her hand, then said to Adam, "She's very striking." How she had complimented Lauren's eloquence and strong presence in the same tone someone might use to describe a dog learning a new trick. How she had offered to host their rehearsal dinner, but had made sure none of her friends attended. She remembered how Adam had tried to shield her, how he had argued with his parents behind closed doors, how he had defended their love. But he had also been tired, caught in the impossible position of loving two worlds that refused to touch. Now he was gone, and she was alone in the storm. Jaden had asked her the next day if he could skip the weekend visit. He didn't say why, and she didn't ask. But she noticed he started calling his grandparents Barbara and Henry, instead of Grandma and Grandpa. She didn't correct him. The weeks passed, and the visits became less frequent. Then, one night, as Lauren was tucking Jaden into bed, he asked, "Why do they not want to hug me anymore?" Lauren felt something inside her break. She didn't have the words, not yet, but the seed of anger planted at the funeral was beginning to bloom. Not the kind of anger that exploded, but the kind that smoldered, that transformed into resolve. She would not let them make her son feel unworthy, even if it meant walking away from what little family they had left. The last few visits had come and gone, each one leaving a faint bruise on Lauren's spirit, the kind that didn't show on skin but sank deeper into the bones. They had stopped being regular, by mutual quiet agreement, not official cancellation. Barbara and Henry no longer asked, and Lauren no longer reminded. The silence was easier than the cold welcomes, the strained smiles, the way Henry always seemed to keep one eye on the clock, like he was counting down the minutes until Jaden was gone. But that silence came with its own weight. Jaden stopped mentioning his grandparents. He no longer brought up the coloring books they used to keep for him or the garden where he had once helped Henry pull weeds while Adam took pictures of them from the porch. That little boy, so full of eagerness to be seen and loved, had become more watchful, more thoughtful. Not withdrawn, not exactly, just quiet in a way Lauren hadn't seen before. It frightened her. In school, his teachers said he was doing fine. Above average, actually. Polite, curious, bright. But when Lauren looked at him at home, tracing the outlines of his drawings with the back of a crayon, or sitting with his chin in his hand, staring at the wall without blinking, she knew something was shifting inside him, something he didn't know how to name yet. The confirmation came on a Thursday evening in early May. Lauren had just finished grading papers at the kitchen table, the remains of their spaghetti dinner pushed to the side, when Jaden came out of his room holding a piece of paper. His brow was furrowed with concentration, lips pressed into a straight line. "I made something," he said. She smiled and wiped her hands. "Let me see." He handed it to her wordlessly and waited. It was a drawing, simple but vivid. 3 figures stood side by side, a woman with dark brown skin and long curly hair, a boy with a wide smile and short, neat twists, and a tall man drawn in faint outline. The colors on the man were faded, almost ghost-like. Above them the sun beamed, and little hearts floated around the woman and the boy. Lauren felt her breath catch. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Is that us?" He nodded. "And, Dad?" Her eyes welled. "You even gave him a shadow." "He's still with us," Jaden said, "even if they pretend he's not." She looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Then he sat down across from her, resting his arms on the table. "They don't talk about him anymore," he said. "Barbara and Henry. When I go there, it's like he never existed. No pictures, no stories, just silence." Lauren swallowed hard. "They gave me a book about George Washington last time. Said I should learn about real role models." Her throat tightened. "Did you tell them how that made you feel?" He looked down. "No, I didn't think they'd care." She wanted to scream, wanted to drive over to that spotless house in Northwood Hills and throw every picture of Adam they'd hidden back onto their walls. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I care," she said. "You can always tell me." He nodded, but she could see the hesitancy, the internal weighing of what it meant to speak truthfully in a world that sometimes punished children for honesty. The next morning, she sent a polite but firm message to Barbara declining the following weekend's visit. No explanation. No apology. Barbara didn't respond. It was around that time that Lauren started sleeping poorly again. She would wake in the middle of the night, breathless, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, her mind racing with images, not of Adam, but of Jaden, years from now, carrying the weight of being tolerated but not embraced, slowly teaching himself to shrink so he wouldn't offend people who claimed to be his family. At work, she began showing up early and staying late, throwing herself into lesson planning, grading, curriculum revisions, anything to keep her mind from circling the same thoughts over and over. One afternoon, while organizing supplies in her classroom, her colleague Michelle stopped by. "You look exhausted," Michelle said gently. "Everything all right at home?" Lauren gave her a small smile. "Just a lot going on. You know, you can talk to me, right?" Lauren hesitated. Then, uncharacteristically, she nodded. She told her about the family tension, not all of it, just the outline. About how Adam's parents were cordial but distant, how Jaden was starting to notice. Michelle didn't interrupt. She just listened. "I'm scared," Lauren admitted. "Scared that he's starting to believe their silence means something about him." "It always does," Michelle said quietly. "Children notice everything." That evening, Lauren walked into the apartment and found Jaden curled up on the couch with a book in his lap, frowning. "Hey, love," she said, kicking off her shoes. "How was your day?" He shrugged. "We had visitors at school." "Yeah?" "Some parents came in to talk about their jobs. One of the kids' grandpas was there. He brought photos of his son and grandson building a treehouse." She sat beside him. "That sounds fun." He looked up at her. Why don't Barbara and Henry ever tell me stories about Dad? Lauren's breath caught. I ask sometimes, he continued, but they just say he was busy a lot. Or they change the subject. I don't think they want to remember him. That's not true, she said too quickly. He raised an eyebrow in a way that reminded her painfully of Adam. Okay, she sighed. Maybe it is. He turned away. I miss him, he said. I do too. Then he added, so quietly she almost didn't hear, sometimes I feel like I'm not enough like him for them to care about me. Her body stiffened. A cold bolt of rage surged through her, white-hot and controlled only by years of conditioning. She pulled him close, held him against her chest. You are more than enough, she whispered. Don't you ever believe anything else. But that night, when he had fallen asleep, she sat in the kitchen staring at the wall and wondered how many other little cuts he had taken without telling her. How many invisible wounds were already forming, slow and silent. She couldn't protect him from everything. She knew that. But she also knew she could no longer justify keeping the door open to people who couldn't see the light in her son. Then, as if the universe had been listening, another blow landed the following week. Jaden's school was holding an open house event to display the students' artwork and projects. Parents and community members were invited. Lauren, of course, had planned to attend. To her surprise, she spotted Barbara entering the school just minutes before the event began, escorted by the school principal, who introduced her as one of the foundation's donors. Lauren kept her distance at first, unsure whether to approach, but then she noticed Jaden, proudly guiding a small group of students toward his art project. It was a large poster board covered in pictures and words about his family, drawings of her and Adam, their favorite foods, a list of things they did together. Barbara walked by, glanced at the board, and froze. Her lips tightened. She turned abruptly, said something polite to the principal, and left without saying a word to Jaden or Lauren. Later, in the car, Jaden asked, "Did Grandma see my project?" "I think so." She didn't say anything. Lauren gripped the steering wheel harder than necessary. That's her choice. Jaden was quiet for a long moment. Then, as they pulled into the driveway, he said, "She didn't like it." Lauren said nothing, but in her mind, something was hardening. A line was drawing itself, firm and final. That night, as she stood washing dishes, she remembered all the time she had told herself to be patient, to keep trying, for Jaden's sake, for Adam's memory, for the hope that something might change. But hope, she realized, was not the same thing as denial. Hope was not excusing harm. Hope was not handing your child over to people who refused to see him. She dried her hands and walked to Jaden's room. He was already in bed, reading by lamplight. "You don't have to go back," she said softly. He looked up. "To their house. If you don't want to, you don't have to." His eyes widened slightly, then relaxed. He closed his book and nodded. "Okay." Lauren smiled. That simple okay was the first step toward something new, something stronger. And though she didn't know it yet, the next chapter of their lives was already waiting, just a few short weeks away, on the other side of an unexpected invitation. The message arrived without preamble on a damp Saturday morning, tucked into Lauren's inbox like a thorn slipped between pages of an old book. It was a single-line email with a subject line that read simply, "Dinner." The body was even shorter. "We're hosting a gathering for Barbara's 70th, Sunday the 12th, 6:30 p.m., family only." No greeting, no signature, no warmth. The words sat stark on the screen, sterile and clinical, like a dental appointment or a corporate memo. Didn't even mention Jaden by name, nor did it extend an invitation so much as it issued a summons. Lauren stared at it for a full minute, unmoving, the cursor blinking patiently beneath the final period. She wasn't surprised. Not really. She had expected something like this eventually. Barbara was the kind of woman who would consider it a social obligation to throw herself a milestone birthday party and dress it in the language of tradition and duty. And she would, of course, invite family. Appearances were everything. If Lauren and Jaden didn't come, it would be noticed, gossiped about, an absence recorded like a stain on a registry. She leaned back in the chair and folded her arms across her chest. The apartment was still and quiet. Outside, rain whispered against the windows, soft and persistent. Jaden was in his room, sprawled on the rug with a sketch pad and colored pencils, humming to himself as he drew. It was his favorite thing lately, sketching imaginary cities, superheroes, and the occasional family portrait, always with her and sometimes with Adam. Never with Barbara or Henry anymore. She considered deleting the message, pretending she never saw it, blocking the sender, but instead she clicked mark as unread and shut the laptop. Later that evening, while they were folding laundry together, Jaden spoke without looking up. "Did something happen today?" Lauren glanced at him. "Why do you ask?" "You've been thinking really hard. You get a wrinkle in your forehead when you think hard." She laughed softly. "I do, huh?" He nodded and matched 2 socks. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to." She hesitated. "There's a dinner next weekend, at Barbara and Henry's, for her birthday." He stopped folding and looked at her. "Are we going?" "I haven't decided." He tilted his head, then turned back to the laundry. "I want to go." The words surprised her. "Why?" "I just do." She waited, but he didn't elaborate. He resumed folding with a quiet focus that made something inside her stir with unease. The next morning, over breakfast, Jaden appeared in a crisp white button-down and navy slacks. "It's not today," she reminded him with a smile. "I know. I just wanted to see how it felt." Lauren lowered her coffee mug. How what felt? Dressing up, like for something important. She studied him. "Is the dinner important to you?" He shrugged. "Not really, but I think I want to look like it is." Her instinct was to press, to ask what he was planning or what thoughts were simmering behind that composed little face, but she held back. Jaden had always been introspective, but lately there was a gravity in his words that gave her pause. He was thinking deeply about something, that much was clear, but she sensed that if she pushed too hard, he might pull away. And so, for the moment, she let it be. Over the course of the week, he returned to that white shirt twice more. Once to iron it with her help, and once to practice tying the small navy tie he had pulled from the back of his closet. It had belonged to Adam once, worn at Jaden's christening, and had hung untouched for years. Now, Jaden stood in front of the mirror, eyes serious, working through knot after knot until he got it just right. He didn't smile when he did. He simply nodded to himself and hung it neatly on a hanger. Lauren watched all of this quietly. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Not something bad, necessarily, but something significant. There was a sense of ceremony in Jaden's preparation, a kind of solemn resolve that made her want to both wrap him in her arms and tell him to wait until he was older before he carried so much. By the time Sunday arrived, Lauren felt the tension in her shoulders like cords drawn tight. She chose a long-sleeved dress in a muted burgundy shade and kept her makeup minimal. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was armor. She hadn't been inside Barbara's house since the funeral. Just the thought of standing in that high-ceilinged foyer again made her stomach knot. As they drove, Jaden sat beside her in the passenger seat, blazer buttoned, tie in place, shoes polished to a quiet gleam. He held a small, hand-drawn birthday card in his lap, decorated with carefully sketched roses and the words, "Happy 70th," written in cursive that he'd practiced for days. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "A little." "You don't have to go through with anything you don't want to." "I know." He looked out the window at the tall trees lining the street, their leaves beginning to turn gold with the early signs of fall. "I just want to be heard," he said softly. Lauren felt her breath catch. They pulled into the long driveway 10 minutes late. The house loomed before them, all brick and symmetry and trimmed hedges. The porch lights were already on, glowing like the stage lights before a play. Lauren sat for a moment, breathing slowly, forcing calm into her lungs. "You ready?" she asked. Jaden nodded. He didn't smile. Inside, the house was pristine, as always. The hardwood floors gleamed, and the air was scented with lemon and something floral. A string quartet played softly from a speaker system. Guests mingled with glasses of white wine and platters of roasted figs and crostini. The decor was tasteful and excessive. Gold-rimmed china, linen napkins, crystal candle holders. Barbara appeared in the doorway to the formal dining room, draped in an ivory blouse and long pearl necklace. She didn't approach. She stood still, eyes scanning them both. "Look who finally made it," she said, voice syrupy. Before Lauren could respond, Barbara's gaze fell to Jaden's attire. She pursed her lips. "Such a serious outfit," she remarked. "Are we attending a wedding?" Jaden didn't respond. He stepped inside, handed her the card, and offered a small nod. Lauren followed, swallowing her instinct to interject. Old habits. Keep the peace. Smile tight. Henry sat near the fireplace, scotch in hand, watching the room with mild disinterest. He acknowledged them with a nod, nothing more. A few other relatives murmured greetings, but none lingered. Dinner was announced promptly. The table stretched long and immaculate, set for 20. Lauren was seated 3 places away from Barbara, with a cousin and a distant aunt on either side who talked over her as if she weren't there. Jaden sat across from her, straight-backed, quiet, hands folded in his lap. Conversation buzzed around the table. Travel plans, new cars, promotions. At one point, Barbara turned to the woman beside her and said, "It's lovely when families stay close, isn't it? So rare these days." The comment floated like smoke across the table. Lauren said nothing. When the main course was cleared, a small chocolate torte was brought out with flickering candles. The room dimmed slightly as the candles flickered, and a few guests began a soft rendition of Happy Birthday. Barbara closed her eyes and smiled as the song filled the air. It was a performance, every second of it, and when the song ended, she looked around the table with faux humility and said, 70 years, imagine that, and not a single wrinkle worth mentioning. Polite laughter followed. Lauren glanced at Jaden. He was still sitting tall, eyes fixed on his plate. He hadn't touched his cake. Then he looked at her very deliberately. "Can I say something?" he asked. The room was still buzzing with low conversation. Lauren met his eyes. They were steady, focused. She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. Jaden pushed his chair back gently, the soft scrape against the floor catching just enough attention for a few heads to turn. He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Straightened his tie, then cleared his throat. Lauren felt the air shift, and she knew This was the moment they would not come back from. The room fell into a kind of stunned quiet, the kind that ripples just under the surface of polite company. Silverware paused mid-air, conversations trailed off without conclusion, and heads turned with a mix of curiosity and confusion. Jaden stood at the end of the long dining table, no taller than the back of his chair, but holding himself with a composure far beyond his years. He didn't rush. He unfolded the paper slowly, smoothed it out between his small hands, and looked up, not at his mother, not at the candles or the cake, but directly at Barbara. Lauren felt her breath catch, her chest tight with anticipation. A dozen instincts flared in her at once: protect, intervene, soften the blow. But she sat frozen, her hand resting against the stem of her wineglass, her knuckles pale. She had nodded. She had given permission. Whatever came next, she would not take that from him now. "I dressed up tonight," Jaden began, his voice soft but clear, "because I wanted to be taken seriously." A few small murmurs rustled through the room, uncertain and uncomfortable. Barbara's smile remained fixed in place, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "I wore this because it's supposed to mean I'm doing something important. And I am." He glanced at the paper in his hand, then continued, no longer reading. "I've been to this house a lot of times. I've eaten at this table, played in the backyard, listened to people talk about how great Dad was. And he was the best." He swallowed, steadying himself. "But I've also been quiet for a long time. Too long. And I've heard a lot of things. Not always loud things. Sometimes whispered. Sometimes said with a smile like it's a joke, like it shouldn't hurt. But it does." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the table. "When people say I don't look like my dad, or when they call me the boy instead of my name, or when they talk about my mom like she's just someone who tagged along, I hear it. I always hear it. And it makes me feel like I'm not part of this family, like I'm not supposed to be here." The silence now was complete. Even the background music had been lowered, or perhaps it had simply faded into irrelevance. "I know I don't look like you," he went on, "and I know you probably wish I looked more like Dad, but I'm still his son. He used to say that I had his heart. That's what matters." His eyes landed back on Barbara. "And you make my mom feel small. You say things that sound polite but aren't. You smile when you say things that make her want to cry. And I see that, even if you think I don't." His voice cracked slightly, but he straightened his shoulders and pushed forward. "She's kind and strong. She works hard. She gives everything to me, and she loved Dad just like he loved her. But you act like she doesn't belong, like I don't belong." He paused then, as if the weight of his words had suddenly caught up to him. "I don't want to come here anymore," he said, "because it hurts. And if you can't be kind to my mom, if you can't see us as part of your family, then maybe we're not. Maybe we never were." He folded the paper again, slowly, carefully, and looked at Lauren. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. "We're leaving, right, Mom?" Lauren felt herself rise before her mind even told her to. Her legs moved on instinct, steady despite the tremor in her chest. She could feel every eye on her, the heat of their silence pressing against her skin, but she kept her focus on her son. Her voice was low but firm. "Yes," she said, "we are." She picked up her purse, her coat still draped over the back of the chair. Around the table, no one spoke. Henry was stiff in his seat, lips drawn into a thin line. A few of the cousins looked stunned, one of them wide-eyed, fork frozen mid-air. Barbara hadn't moved. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression composed, as if carved from porcelain. Lauren reached for Jaden's hand, and together they turned toward the front hallway. Their footsteps echoed in the quiet room, each one a beat in a rhythm they'd never danced before but somehow knew by heart. As they reached the door, Barbara's voice floated after them, sharp and cool. "Don't do this." Lauren stopped. She turned halfway, enough to see Barbara's face. "You'll regret raising him soft," Barbara added, louder now. "The world won't care about his feelings." Lauren faced her fully then, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel small under that gaze. "I'm not raising him to be soft," she said. "I'm raising him to be kind, and brave, and honest. Things he clearly didn't learn in this house." Barbara's lips parted slightly, as if to reply, but no sound came. Behind her, Henry's eyes shifted away, focusing instead on the untouched piece of cake in front of him. Lauren turned back, opened the front door, and stepped into the cool evening air. The wind brushed against her cheeks, crisp and bracing, like a slap and an embrace all at once. She hadn't realized how stifling the air inside had been until she was free of it. Beside her, Jaden held her hand tightly. "Did I do okay?" he asked, almost in a whisper. She knelt beside him, cupping his face in both hands. "You didn't just do okay," she said. "You were extraordinary." He smiled then, small but real. It lit his eyes the way Adam's used to, bright and open, full of soul. They walked to the car in silence, the night folding gently around them. The party continued behind the closed door. Music resumed, glasses clinked, the hum of conversation creeping back in. But none of it mattered. None of it belonged to them. Inside the car, Lauren exhaled deeply, her fingers trembling slightly on the wheel. Jaden buckled his seatbelt without a word. She started the engine, pulled out of the driveway, and headed toward home. As they turned onto the main road, he looked out the window and said, almost to himself, "It feels lighter." She glanced at him. "What does?" "Everything." She reached over and squeezed his hand. For once, she had no impulse to correct him, to soften the truth, to fill the silence. She let it sit there, pure and whole. Back at the apartment, Jaden kicked off his shoes and peeled off the blazer, tossing it over the couch before heading to the kitchen. "Can we make popcorn?" he called. Lauren laughed, the sound sudden and clean, like breaking glass. "Yes," she said. "Popcorn sounds perfect." They made it together, standing shoulder to shoulder, the smell of butter filling the small space. He danced around the kitchen while it popped, and she let herself laugh again. Real laughter, not the brittle kind she used to wear like a mask at Barbara's dinner parties. Later, as he curled on the couch with a bowl in his lap and a movie starting on the screen, Lauren sat beside him, watching not the film, but him. The way his shoulders had relaxed, the way he leaned against her like he used to when he was small. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be questions, perhaps backlash, maybe even guilt, trying to sneak back in like a thief in the dark. But tonight, they had taken a step neither of them could have imagined a year ago. They had stood up in a room full of people who refused to see them and claim the space they deserved. And in doing so, they had begun to write their own story. Not one about survival, but one about truth and love and choosing peace over performance. The night after the party was the quietest one Lauren could remember in years. Not the kind of quiet that followed tension, not the brittle silence that used to hang between polite words and gritted smiles at Barbara's table. This quiet felt earned, like the stillness after a long storm, not the eye of it. the kind that let you breathe without waiting for the next blow. She and Jaden had shared popcorn and laughter, a movie neither of them really watched, and then curled up in their mismatched armchairs with a soft blanket between them. She hadn't expected sleep to come so easily, but it did. It wasn't a sleep of exhaustion or retreat. It was the kind that followed release. And when morning broke and the light spilled through the thin curtains of their living room, it did so gently, as if the world itself had agreed to let them rest. Lauren woke early, padding into the kitchen in her slippers, the scent of Jaden's cereal already lingering in the air. He sat at the table in his pajamas, chin propped on one hand, reading a comic book. When he looked up, his face was calm, but there was a depth in his eyes, something different. Not heavier exactly, but older, more knowing. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," he replied. They didn't talk about the night before at first. They didn't need to. The truth of it had been spoken. Anything else would have felt like commentary on a chapter already closed. Still, as they sat across from one another, Lauren watching him from behind her coffee mug, the images began to surface in her mind again, slow and vivid, like photographs in a developing tray. She had felt it coming, of course. Jaden's quiet determination in the days leading up to the party had carried a kind of purpose that frightened her, only because she knew that whatever he was building inside himself had weight. Not a tantrum, not a childish cry for attention, but something grounded and precise. She remembered the moment he had asked her at the table, "Can I say something?" She had said yes without fully understanding what it would mean. But the second he rose from his chair and unfolded that paper with steady hands, she had known she wouldn't stop him. Not even if Barbara's house had burst into flames around them. And now, 24 hours later, the memory of his words rang just as clear. No shouting, no theatrics, just truth, clean and unflinching. The kind of truth that doesn't ask permission. At the table, Jaden turned a page of his comic book and asked, as casually as if he were talking about the weather, "Do you think she heard me?" Lauren considered this. "I think everyone did." She didn't say anything. "No," Lauren said. "She didn't. She just sat there." "Yes." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "Do you think she'll ever call again?" Lauren hesitated. "Maybe, maybe not." "I don't really want her to." Lauren studied him carefully. "That's okay." They finished breakfast in quiet, and then life resumed. The following week passed like any other. School, work, errands, dinner. But beneath the normalcy, Lauren felt a slow shift taking place. Something had settled in her chest. Not fear, not dread, but clarity. The kind that came when a page had finally turned, and there was no going back. On Tuesday afternoon, she opened the family group chat, the same one that had been used for holidays, announcements, passive-aggressive messages, and the occasional photo of someone's dog. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a long time before she typed the message. "Jaden and I will not be attending future gatherings. Please respect our decision." This is not up for discussion. She read it 3 times, making sure it was firm without anger, final without cruelty. Then she hit send and placed the phone face down on the counter. It buzzed twice a few minutes later. A thumbs-up emoji from her sister-in-law, a single word from Adam's brother. Understood. And nothing from Barbara. Lauren didn't expect anything different. That night, after Jaden was asleep, she sat on the couch alone, wrapped in a soft blanket, her feet tucked beneath her, and let herself think through the events of that party again. Not the drama of it, the spectacle, but the meaning. She hadn't known, in the moment, just how much Jaden had absorbed over the years. The sly remarks, the subtle dismissals, the way Barbara's compliments had always come with conditions. He's polite for a boy. He's smart, must get that from Adam. You should dress him in lighter colors. Lauren had endured those moments with a practiced smile and folded hands, telling herself it wasn't worth the confrontation, that keeping the peace was the right thing, that family was complicated, but Jaden had seen it all, and more than that, he had remembered it. The way she shrank, the way she silenced herself. And he had decided, with all the bravery of someone who didn't yet know how the world punishes such clarity, that enough was enough. It made her ache, proud and guilty all at once, because it should have been her. She should have stood up years ago. She should have protected him from the casual cruelty that wore the mask of civility. But instead, it had been her son who spoke when she couldn't. She thought of Adam then, not with sorrow, but with a soft ache. Would he have done the same? Would he have stood beside them? Lauren believed he would have. She believed that wherever his spirit lingered, it had heard Jaden's words and felt the truth in them. Later that week, Lauren began looking up local therapists. It wasn't something she'd ever seriously considered before. She had always powered through, told herself she was strong enough. But now, with the dust settling and the quiet thickening, she realized that strength wasn't always about pushing forward. Sometimes it was about unpacking what you carried, piece by piece. She scheduled her first appointment for the following Monday. When the day came, she sat in the waiting room, her hands knotted in her lap, and when the therapist asked her why she was there, Lauren didn't pause. "I don't want to repeat what I grew up with," she said. The words were simple, but they carried decades inside them. The therapist nodded as if she understood, and Lauren believed she did. Over the next few weeks, something else changed. The space in their apartment, already small and familiar, began to feel brighter, not because anything had shifted physically, but because the air itself felt freer. Lauren and Jaden began creating new traditions. On what would have been Thanksgiving at Barbara's, they went to the lake instead, feeding ducks and eating hot dogs from a cart. For Christmas, they stayed in pajamas all day, made pancakes for dinner, and watched every version of the Grinch they could find. On Mother's Day, Jaden brought her breakfast in bed. Toast and cereal, with the crusts cut into little heart shapes. "I like our family now," he said. She reached out and pulled him into her arms. "Me too." And though not every day was perfect, though doubts still crept in sometimes, whispering that maybe she had gone too far, maybe she had overreacted, Lauren reminded herself of Jaden's face that night at the dinner table. The calm certainty in his eyes. The way he had said, "We're leaving," and believed it with his whole chest. Peace, she had learned, was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of safety, of love, of respect. They hadn't just walked away from a dinner party. They had walked away from a story that had never been written for them, and now they were writing their own. The first thing Lauren noticed after the final message was sent, after the group chat fell silent, was that the heaviness she'd carried for years began to shift. It didn't vanish overnight, nor did it lift cleanly like a curtain pulled back at dawn, but it began to move, gently, quietly, the way a winter thaw starts with nothing more than a drip. And beneath that slow melt, there was something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Space. Not physical space. She and Jaden still lived in the same modest apartment, with the same thrift store couch and the same humming refrigerator, but emotional space. Breathing room, a stillness that wasn't loaded with expectation or judgment or the need to rehearse what she would say to people who didn't truly see her. Barbara never replied to the message, not with anger, not with confusion, not with questions, just silence. And somehow that told Lauren more than any reply could have. It was confirmation of what she had always known, but been too afraid to name, that she and Jaden had never truly been seen as family by Barbara and Henry. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. Her silence wasn't grief. It was rejection. But it was a quiet rejection, one that wore pearls and practiced smiles. The kind that had expected Lauren to keep showing up, grateful just to be tolerated. She no longer was. After the message went out, Jaden didn't ask questions. He didn't press for details or try to guess who said what. He simply accepted it with a nod, as though he had known all along this would be the result of what he had spoken aloud. And, in some way, Lauren realized he had. The changes in their home were subtle at first. They began to create new rituals without meaning to. On Sundays, they started walking to the nearby bookstore after breakfast, browsing through the shelves for used novels and comic books. They cooked together more often, experimenting with strange recipes that sometimes flopped hilariously. Jaden developed a fondness for breakfast for dinner nights. On Saturdays, they built elaborate pillow forts and watched old movies, narrating scenes in silly accents. And it wasn't just the traditions, it was the feel of their home. The way Jaden smiled more freely, laughed from his belly instead of behind his hand. The way Lauren no longer caught herself staring at her phone, waiting for a message that would make her shrink. She found herself standing taller, even when she didn't notice it. In the mirror, her eyes seemed clearer. She was no longer walking on eggshells inside her own body. There were difficult nights, too. Grief is never linear. Some evenings she found herself spiraling into memory, thinking of Adam, of how much he had wanted to keep peace between the people he loved. She wondered what he would have thought of that night. Would he have supported them? Would he have stepped in before it ever reached that point? She believed he would have. She had to. But more than that, she knew that the legacy Adam had left behind wasn't the family name or the house on the hill or the connections his parents tried so hard to protect. It was Jaden. This quiet, fierce boy who loved wholly, spoke truthfully, and stood bravely in a room full of people who didn't understand him. Lauren thought often about that night now, not with regret, but with reverence. The speech Jaden had given wasn't just a boy expressing his hurt. It had been a declaration, a line drawn, a mirror held up not just to Barbara and Henry, but to Lauren herself. In his words, she had seen the version of herself she had always longed to be, unapologetic, clear-eyed, unafraid to walk away when kindness was no longer offered. That awareness shaped everything that came next. She kept going to therapy, each session peeling back more of the emotional scaffolding she'd built around herself. She spoke openly now about the generational expectations she had grown up with, the demand to keep quiet, to avoid conflict, to maintain appearances at the cost of peace. And slowly she began to unlearn them. She told Jaden, too, in small ways, not as lectures, but in the way she responded when he was upset, when he asked hard questions. She told him that boundaries were love, that silence was not always peace, and that speaking up wasn't a flaw, it was a strength. She wanted him to know that truth was never the enemy, and that love should never require him to shrink. As the year progressed, their life began to feel more rooted, more intentional. When Thanksgiving arrived, Lauren didn't even think about the old rituals. She and Jaden packed a picnic basket with sandwiches and thermoses of hot cocoa and drove to the lake outside town. They watched ducks glide through the water and fed them pieces of torn bread, laughing as they squabbled and chased each other. It was simple and quiet and utterly free of performance. For Christmas, they hung a modest strand of lights along the window and bought a tiny artificial tree from the dollar store. They decorated it with paper snowflakes and garlands made of popcorn. They stayed in pajamas all day and watched animated movies, opening a few small presents they had wrapped for each other: books, art supplies, a pair of silly socks. Lauren had never felt more full, and on Mother's Day, she woke to the sound of clinking in the kitchen and the soft shuffle of feet. Jaden appeared a few minutes later, balancing a tray with cereal, toast cut into heart shapes, and a glass of orange juice. His face was solemn with pride, his hands steady. "I like our family now," he said simply as he handed her the tray. Lauren pulled him into a hug, too moved to speak. She didn't pretend everything was perfect. There were still moments when guilt tried to creep back in, whispers in the back of her mind asking if she had overreacted, if she had cut ties too hastily, if she had failed Adam somehow by not keeping the bridge standing. But every time she looked at Jaden, at how much lighter he seemed, how safe he looked in his own skin, those whispers faded. Because what they had now was real. Lauren had stopped chasing a version of family that existed only in name and obligation. She had stopped offering herself up to be picked apart in the name of tradition. She had stopped trying to earn the approval of people who had never truly made space for her. Instead, she had chosen to build something better, not louder, not grander, but kinder. One evening, while Jaden was in bed, Lauren sat in the living room wrapped in a blanket, her tea warm in her hands. The television was on low, more background than anything else. The light from the kitchen glowed soft and golden. She thought about how many years she had spent chasing the idea of acceptance, how many times she had walked into Barbara's house hoping this time would be different, how many times she had walked out feeling smaller, less seen, less real. And then she thought about that night, about her son, dressed in a blazer 2 sizes too big, clearing his throat at a table full of people who had chosen to remain blind. About the way he said, "We're leaving," and the way she finally found her voice in his. She thought about how he had saved her that night, and how she had finally let herself be saved. Later, before bed, she walked into his room to check on him. He was already asleep, one hand resting on his cheek, the other curled near his chest. His breathing was deep and even. Lauren bent down and kissed his forehead. "Thank you," she whispered, not just for speaking the truth, but for showing her how to live it. Outside, the city hummed softly. Somewhere in the distance, wind rustled through the leaves, and in that small apartment, lit by nothing more than faith and a string of fairy lights, a new kind of family rested. One that had chosen itself. One that no longer looked back. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and check out the next video for another powerful journey.